Fyodor Shestakov, a 34-year-old man, was a completely ordinary metro resident. He was neither a brave stalker nor an experienced digger. In general, he didn't know how to do anything special, so he did two things at the station. Most of the time he drove the trolley with passengers to other stations, not a difficult task, since the trolley can only go in two directions. His task was only to regulate its speed and explain things to the guards at the checkpoint. True, there were extreme situations in his practice, when they were attacked in the tunnel by mutants who somehow got there, but since all trolleys, be they passenger and especially caravan, always had armed guards, the incidents ended with a short shootout, after which they continued on their way. His second job was worse. As a healthy male in his prime, he was required to stand guard at the checkpoints at the entrance to the tunnel. Although checkpoint is an exaggeration, a bit of construction debris, located so that a handcar could pass through, and an eternal fire, which saved the sentries from the icy tunnel drafts. He wasn't exactly a bad sentry. He was smart enough not to sleep on duty, and he didn't really have to do anything. The senior guard spoke to everyone who came, while Fyodor simply stood there with his machine gun lowered, supposedly saying, "We are peaceful people, but don't you dare try anything." He frankly hated this job, sitting for several hours without closing his eyes and peering into the darkness, taking a book with you to kill time or, God forbid, a deck of playing cards was a sure way to get a reprimand from your superiors. The only thing that entertained us at such hours was when a conversation arose, and the sentries quietly talked to each other, telling each other hackneyed tales, jokes, and various gossip. True, this entertainment was possible only at the post near the station itself. The second post, located 150 meters deep into the tunnel, was more solid and discipline was strictly maintained there. Now Fyodor was holding his position, sitting on a piece of cardboard by the fire, right at the post where the tunnel exits to the station platform. The senior guard, nicknamed Sadoy, was standing and smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. It was unknown what kind of sawdust was there. There was no smell of tobacco. And next to him sat Fyodor's old friend, Viktor Sleptsov, nicknamed Horse. "And I'm telling you, your profession is boring. What fun is there in driving a handcar from one station to another and doing that almost every day? A digger is a different matter. Helping the remnants of humanity survive. Looking for underground caches of food and weapons. Can you imagine the feeling when you crawl on your belly for 100 meters through some skinning pits and come out to a closet filled to the brim with zinc boxes with cartridges or provisions?" Horse was indeed a digger. He knew exactly all the holes in the vicinity of the nearest stations, and, not for the first time, tried to persuade his friend to go with him. "Oh yeah, exactly. And then you'll gorge yourself on canned food like Winnie the Pooh and get stuck." Fyodor wasn't sure that being a couple of years younger and having a poor memory of life before the disaster, Vitya could remember who Winnie the Pooh was. But Horse didn't show it and was about to object. However, the guard leader got ahead of him. "Yeah, and how are you going to drag these zincs to the station?" Sadoy finished him off with arguments. Okay, let's forget about it. I'm speaking figuratively, and anyway, shh." Sadoy hissed at him and added, "Someone is coming." And indeed, during the conversation, Fyodor did not notice that the light of a lantern appeared in the tunnel, and it was approaching the post quite quickly, since the unknown person with the lantern had to overcome the distant checkpoint before them, and they would have definitely heard the shots. There was no particularly violent reaction, but for some reason he still felt uneasy. Maybe something had happened on the far side, and they had sent word. However, the man who had come out of the darkness of the tunnel, having prudently turned off his flashlight, was unfamiliar to Fyodor. He was pale. No, of course, in the metro with life without the sun, no one was shining with a tan, but he was downright painfully pale. He wanted to approach Gray, recognizing him as the main one, but Gray stopped him with a wave of his hand. "Who is it?" Gray asked sternly. "I'm a messenger, and I have an urgent message for the station chief from Prokofiev himself." "Wow, these are people. Did something happen?" The guard commander expressed surprise. The messenger hesitated a little and said something briefly, so that Fyodor couldn't hear anything. But from Seti's grimace, it was clear that it was really important. Sweat appeared on his forehead, although the draft from the tunnel pierced the bone marrow with cold. The messenger went on, and they sat in silence for the remaining hour and a half, until the end of the day shift. At first, Horse was about to ask Gray what was going on, but Gray made it clear that it was classified information. Fyodor couldn't get what had happened out of his head and thought about it. Nikolai Prokofiev was the leader of their community, which consisted of 4 stations. Fyodor himself lived at the furthest station on the Blue Line. They were separated by 2 stops.
Then there was another Union station, from which one could transfer to another Red Line.
Another community lived there, although their way of life was very similar. Ironically, another community also occupied 4 stations. Another 2 metro stations were abandoned. One was flooded, the other was shallow. These 2 communities traded with each other, maintaining good, neighborly relations, but both jealously defended the territory, which caused a couple of scandals when our and their stalkers could not divide the territory on the city's surface. Fyodor thought it was absurd. The city, as far as he knew, lay in ruins, radiating radiation, and the creatures that lived there were no comparison with what could be found in the tunnels. Therefore, it would be better for people to unite. But no, theirs are constantly trying to get into our half, and ours into theirs. His thoughts were interrupted by Horse's voice. "Well, Fedya, bye. Good luck there with Katyuka."
Fyodor beamed. How could he forget? Today, he had a date with Ekaterina Frolova. This girl is 10 years younger than him, but they still became quite close. He first met her while working as a helmsman on a handcar. The girl lived at the central station, but the hectic life of the capital apparently did not appeal to her, and a couple of years ago she moved to the outskirts of the station, where Fyodor lived. She quickly settled in, began working on the farm, and, from time to time, on duty in the canteen. However, she still had relatives in the capital, and, at first, she often went there, not sparing the fare, to meet them. And this often happened during Fyodor's shift. Even then, she caught his eye and smiled at him. Then somehow, they began to communicate. At first awkwardly, then more freely. And so, over time, simple, friendly relations grew into something more. Yes, they were in love. "Why are you standing there grinning like an idiot?" If you do that in front of her, she definitely won't let you. Horsley noted and laughed.
Despite his prestigious profession, he was not married, and in general, he had no luck with girls. Maybe because he was a confirmed bachelor. Or maybe it was because of his sense of humor. Digger knows his way around all sorts of holes. As soon as he uttered his favorite phrase, the girls' faces immediately changed their expression. First to bewilderment, then to anger, after which the joker usually hit him on the cheek, and that was the end of their communication. The friends shook hands, and after handing over their weapons to the armory, Fyodor went to the bar. That was the name of the nook near the canteen, where, in addition to mushroom soup and porridge, they served home-brewed beer. And there was also the pride of their station, a barbecue. It was there that the date was arranged. When Fyodor approached, the girl was not there yet.
She was working on the farm today, and they figured they would be free at about the same time.
However, he did not have to wait long. He saw her from afar. She was dressed in old jeans and a dark green windbreaker. It was a little chilly on the platform. Her chestnut hair casually fell to her shoulders. There was something like a shower at their station, although, for some reason, everyone called it a bathhouse. In Fyodor's life before the end of the world, there was a shower stall in his parents' house, and he knew what it was. At the moment when the old world collapsed, Fyodor was 11 years old. His parents were already sending him to school alone, especially since it was only one trip on the subway. Of course, they insisted on the bus, considering that it was unsafe to let a child on the subway.
But on that day it was his disobedience that saved his life. So, some girls allowed themselves long hair.
Katya, smiling sweetly, approached Fyodor, tearing him out of his thoughts. Hugging and kissing impulsively, they went to the bar. Having taken a table, they began to think about what to order. When Fyodor mentioned home brew, Katya winced, and they decided not to take alcohol. They ordered mushroom tea and pork shashlik. Of course, pieces of pork fried on a grill, oozing with fat, are not very romantic, but incredibly tasty. Although, of course, they were noticeably more expensive than rat meat, which was perfectly cooked on the same grill. But that evening Fyodor did not feel sorry for the wasted cartridges. They laughed merrily and had a good time all evening, until one bald, rather drunk soldier at the next table decided to make a joke, first showing indecent gestures hinting at intercourse, and then, despite the fact that his drinking buddies tried to calm him down, shouted, "Come on, Taxa,
Put it in her already!" Dachshund was Fyodor's nickname, derived from the word taxi driver. But that wasn't what bothered him. The girl, embarrassed, looked down, and he, on the contrary, abruptly stood up from the table and, looking at the soldier's grinning red face like a monkey, clenched his fists and menacingly moved towards their table, imagining how he would slam his face into the tabletop. But the soldier, for some reason, despite his alcohol intoxication, did not show aggression, but raised his hands in a conciliatory manner. "Oh, come on, calm down, I love you!" Fyodor realized that perhaps he had indeed reacted too harshly and returned to the table. The girl looked at him with fear.
"Maybe we should go?"
She suggested. Fyodor agreed.
After some discussion, they decided to go to him, his little plywood closet, dragged by an acquaintance. But unfortunately, the now-deceased stalker, Yurik, Fyodor's friend, was larger than the girl's tent standing in the far corner of the station. The mood returned to a positive channel, and they walked along the platform, laughing at that drunken warrior, calling him the leader of the red-faced, until some old woman stuck her head out of one of the tents and began to threaten them that she would complain to the station manager about them making such a noise in the middle of the night. Having wished old woman Luda good night, Fyodor and Katya went into his modest abode. The shack where Fedya lived was not particularly richly decorated, although by metro standards, it was considered quite prosperous. He kept his things in a box that had been used for something large. There were books in another box. A third of the room was taken up by a folding bed. The only decoration was a clock hanging on a nail driven into the wall. True, it didn't work. The batteries were too expensive. "Wow, this is a real mansion," the girl admired. "That's right," Fyodor said proudly, and lit a kerosene lamp standing right on the floor. In general, through the door, which was a curtain covering the doorway when it was open. During the day, there was enough light. But Fyodor loved to read, and having reasoned sensibly, decided that the price he sometimes paid for kerosene for the lamp was cheaper than if he paid for reading with damaged eyesight. By the way, the girl was also interested in the books. Approaching them, she turned around and, guessing her thoughts, Fyodor nodded. Ekaterina began to rummage through the box with books, taking them out one by one, examined the covers, and carefully put them back. "I didn't think you had so many books. Listen," the girl smiled disarmingly. "Can you give me something to read?" Fyodor was pleasantly surprised. He himself, of course, was not sure of this, but he heard that many of the younger generation cannot read. Apparently, this was not so.
"Of course, take it."
"Can you advise anything?" Well, Fyodor didn't expect such a question and was a little confused.
Exactly. Wait a second.
Having said this, Fyodor himself began to rummage through the box of books. For a long time, he could not find the one he was looking for, and was already thinking of offering another one. But suddenly he saw the very one.
Here.
He said solemnly, taking out a tattered volume.
A science fiction book. I exchanged it in the capital. It was written shortly before the catastrophe, and it also wrote about the post-apocalypse. And the author was really right in some ways, although much turned out to be fiction. But it is still very interesting. True, there are a couple of pages missing, and the book is not exactly funny. I would even say heavy.
Nothing, thank you. Katya took the book from his hands and kissed him on the cheek. Then they somehow fit on the folding bed and hugged each other and began to talk about life, discuss the future. It was uncomfortable to lie down, and they began to say goodbye. Bye. It was fun. By the way, are you working tomorrow? Ekaterina asked. Yes, on a handcar as usual. Why? Yes, I think maybe we could meet again. I could ride with you on a handcar. I just need to go to the capital. The girl winked conspiratorially. They parted. Fyodor put out the lamp and lay down on the folding bed. He was in a good mood and almost didn't want to sleep, but he forced himself to close his eyes. After all, really, tomorrow is work. Chapter 2. The Campaign. Fyodor woke up from a loud knock, after which the curtain was unceremoniously pulled back. He was surprised to find that the same leader of the red-faced had burst into his room, although the warrior's face was now a normal color and showed practically no traces of yesterday's drinking bout. Get up, Fedya. Your motherland is calling. What? Fyodor was irritated. This woodpecker is talking nonsense again. The war has begun, I say, the soldier explained. Are you serious? Fyodor still couldn't believe what he heard. No, I'm just kidding. Get up and go to the armory, and then we'll see. Having dressed hastily, Fyodor walked quickly to the room in the tunnel occupied by the armory. There was already Sipli, and another guy he barely knew. I think his name was Leka. Hello, Fedya, the friend greeted in a sad voice. They shook hands in greeting. Vitya looked unwell. His face was pale, his red hair was disheveled. Apparently he had been pulled out of bed in the same way. Do you know already? War? War. And who? If only I knew, although in my opinion everything is clear anyway. But the conversation was interrupted by a soldier who arrived, turning the key and opening the impressive lock. He opened the door, and they began to get ready. Take the machine guns, a couple of spare magazines, gas masks, and our station chief has prepared a surprise for us. It turns out we have bulletproof vests from the police station, just in case. Well, I think that this very case has already come, so don't be shy. Take them. Fyodor began to get ready. Due to ignorance, putting on the bulletproof vest turned out to be difficult. After he dealt with it and put on the unloading vest over it, Fyodor grabbed the machine gun, stuffed spare clips into the unloading vest, took a holster with a knife, and as a final touch, his pistol that he bought in the capital to protect himself during trips on the trolley. Carrying firearms at the station was prohibited, and he kept it in the armory. Mongol, so what happened? It turns out that Horst knew the name of the bald warrior. Strangely, Fyodor had seen him before, at the station, but did not remember anything about him. Well, if in short what happened was bound to happen anyway, the community on the Red Line decided that it was time to subjugate us and were preparing for war with all their might. So it was time to show them Kuska's mother. But I heard something else, that our highly respected Nikolai Prokofiev had been planning this for a long time. Leka spoke up for the first time. He was a young guy. Fyodor had been on patrol with him a couple of times. The Mongol responded by coming up close to the boy, so that their faces almost touched, and staring at him from top to bottom, who, in turn, immediately became embarrassed and lowered his gaze. Don't say such things, son. I'll forgive you for the first time, after all. Young people are more susceptible to the corrupting influence of enemy propaganda. Do you understand me? Lyoka jerked in fear and quickly nodded in response. Such an address slightly shocked Fyodor, but he did not dare to object. He still could not believe that it would seem that after humanity almost destroyed itself on that terrible day 20 years ago, the survivors should have understood everything and not repeated the mistakes of their ancestors. And here you go again. Only a handful of survivors more or less adapted to life after. So here you go, war again. And after all,
On that side now most likely stand the same men of different ages, torn from life and thrown into the meat grinder by some local tsars whose ambitions and greed are simply disgusting. And because of people like this bald warrior Mongol, who sleeps and dreams of playing war, destruction is not a tricky thing, and only man is given the opportunity to create something, but he is clearly burdened by the shackles of reason. And that is why people are so good at making weapons.
"So the plan is this, Eagles," said Mongol, looking around the small detachment. "The last trolley has left for needs closer to the front line. The entire male population must arrive in the capital for further orders, which is what we will do now. I'll go first, Doxa and Leka in the middle. You bring up the rear, Sipley. What are you standing there for? Step up, Marsh." Having passed the platform where people were bustling about, the squad was already preparing to dive into the mouth of the tunnel. Fyodor was turning his head as they walked, hoping to see Katya among the crowd, but for some reason he couldn't find her. "She's probably already at the farm," thought Fyodor. The measured life of the outlying station was disturbed by news of the war, but life went on, and only the men were leaving for the future battle. When the squad approached the tunnel, the senior patrol officer stood up to meet them, but seeing Mongol, he waved his hand. The squad dived into the darkness of the stretch, cutting it with the beams of their flashlights. It smelled of dampness and coolness. Having walked 150 meters, they stopped at the far post, but moved on without delay. The beam of the flashlight danced along the arches of the tubing, snatching endless kilometers of wires and dark gaps of utility rooms on the sides from the darkness. The tunnel between Fyodor's home station and the neighboring one was unlit. The only rare light bulbs were in the tunnels leading to the capital, so this section was in primordial darkness. Fyodor was here very often, driving a handcar. On foot, the tunnel stretched endlessly long, and an absurd thought came into his head that this tunnel would never end, and he would forever walk along the rails, peering into the concentrated faces of his comrades. In his thoughts, Fyodor did not immediately notice that Mongol, who was briskly walking in front, began to slow down. And after a few minutes, they were barely dragging themselves. Fyodor wanted to ask what was going on, but suddenly, something pulled him back with terrible force, and he fell to the ground. Then someone straddled him, digging a steel grip into his neck. It took Fyodor only a moment to realize that it was none other than his friend with whom he had spent his entire childhood, who was strangling him. Horse was squeezing his neck with both hands, his face expressing desperate anger. How could this happen? How could he? That was all Fyodor had time to think. A wave of anger washed over him. He tore the pistol out of the holster and, pressing it hard into Horse's face, pulled the trigger. Red splashed into his face. Horse was squeezing Fyodor's neck with both hands. How could he? What came over him? Was all that was spinning in Fyodor's fading consciousness. He tugged at his arms, tried to push Horse away from himself, but Horse held him tightly and paid no attention to his resistance. In desperation to take at least a sip of air, Fyodor pulled the pistol out of the holster with his weakened hands. It caught on something very unsuccessfully and did not want to be pulled out. Fyodor didn't have time. Horse was squeezing his neck with both hands, his face expressing desperate anger. "What is this?" Fyodor thought in despair. He pulled out a pistol and was going to save his life by shooting his best friend, when he saw that right above them from the ceiling there was hanging a whitish something. Most of all, it resembled a huge slug, pulsating, stuck to the ceiling. Almost without thinking, Fyodor raised his pistol and fired in its direction without aiming. The shot rang out and Horse, as if burned, abruptly backed away. Fyodor inhaled the cold air with a full chest, but then some substance squirted down from the shot slug from above. Blood, Fyodor thought with disgust when the liquid fell right on his face. And then a terrible pain pierced him. Acid, was all Fyodor managed to think. The pain was not just unbearable. Such pain could not exist at all, and Fyodor screamed, clutching his burned face with his hands. He was thrashing in agony,
rolling on the floor, but suddenly everything stopped abruptly. He spread his arms out to the sides, lying between the rails and breathing heavily. His heart was pounding wildly. Carefully, with trembling hands, he touched his face. He did not feel anything special. Jumping up abruptly, he saw that Horse was sitting next to him on the rails and grimacing, rubbing his ear. It seemed that the shot had stunned him.
Still trying to understand what had happened, his memory was giving out contradictory memories. He looked up. There really was a huge slug on the ceiling, the size of a small pig. It was slowly peeling off the ceiling, and a moment after Fyodor left it, it fell with a slap on the floor. The first thought was to empty the remaining clip into it, but Fyodor did not do this, deciding that the slug was already dead. Turning around, he saw a strange picture. Lyuka, pressing Mongol to the wall, pressed a knife into his chest. While Mongol froze, holding a grenade in his hand, his finger already inserted into the pin. They looked at each other with stunned eyes, and then slowly put away their weapons. "Fuck, if it weren't for the body armor," Mongol exclaimed, seeing that there were at least 3 or even 4 holes in his clothes. "And his chest hurts. You'll answer to me for this, you carrion." "Wait, it wasn't me. I didn't." It was painful to look at Leka. He wilted and seemed ready to cry. "Wait, Mongol," hoarsely said. "I had the same thing, Tux. Fedya, how are you?" He rushed to his friend. "I'll live." "What the hell was that?" Fyodor asked a general question. Then Mongol saw the slug, and a guess was reflected on his face. "Holy shit! It's a brain slug! I thought it was just a story," said Mongol. When he fell silent, they heard hurried steps in the darkness, and soon lanterns appeared from around the bend of the tunnel. 2 guys with machine guns ran up to them and looked at the squad with excitement. "I think we heard a shot," one of them said. "Well, look what's in your tunnel." Mongol stepped aside, and the lookout's eyes widened in surprise, as Fyodor guessed, and a shot slug appeared. Together, they walked along the tunnel, and in a couple of minutes, they came out to the checkpoint. So that's why it confused the lookout so much. The creature was a few meters from the checkpoint, thought Fyodor. Having passed both checkpoints, the squad climbed onto the station platform. Here, as at Fyodor's home station, there was a lot of activity. They heard the hum of people talking in the tunnel, but here people apparently experienced a full range of emotions. Someone was talking. Someone was shouting. Somewhere children were crying. Wives were seeing off their husbands who were loading into a handcar to go to the capital, where their bodies would plug a gap in the defense.
Okay, I'll go to the station master for instructions now. And you wait here. Just don't wander off. Maybe we'll move on right away.
Having given his instructions, Mongol went off to do some business, and the 3 men remained standing on the platform. After the incident in the tunnel, Lyuka was silent and generally looked on well. "Listen, Fedya, forgive me for what happened there. I don't know what came over me." Horsley clearly felt guilty for what happened in the tunnel and tried to find an excuse. Fyodor helped him. "Oh, come on, don't worry. This mutant sort of affected our brains. I read about this in science fiction, but I didn't think that something like this could exist." "Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I felt." Their dialogue interested Leka a little, but there was no continuation because the Mongol returned and began giving orders. "So fighters, now we will go to the capital, but not through the tunnel, but through the surface, yes. I understand that you, unlike me, have never been stalkers, but if the authorities say it is necessary, then it is necessary. So the purpose of this promenade is not only to deliver you to the capital, but also to inspect the area around the entrance to it for enemy sabotage preparations. Is everything clear?" "Then we go to the armory. Chemical protection has already been prepared for us." They walked toward the tunnel opposite the one from which they came. Horse followed them, but Mongol stopped him. "Oh, I almost forgot, Vitya, the station manager wants to see you." "Me? Why?" "Well, we must," Mongol snapped, but then softened, adding, "You know all the underground passages here. You will be an advisor on fortification." After that, they went into the armory, put on chemical protection suits, and Fyodor, having found a cartridge of the right caliber, snapped it into the clip of the pistol to replace the one he had spent. Mongol shook his head, either disapprovingly or surprised by Fyodor's meticulousness in the matter of weapons. While they were getting dressed, Mongol gave them a lecture on the fear of open spaces and the harm of sunlight for metro residents who had become unaccustomed to such eyes. Approaching the hermetic seal and exchanging a few words with the sentries, Mongol ordered them to put on gas masks and turned to his subordinates.
"So, it's not very far to go here, but on the surface you can be eaten before you even leave the lobby. So obey me unquestioningly. I say stand, you stand. I say lie down, you lie down. I say take off your pants and dance, you do it, understand? Okay, and one more thing. At the exit, we'll stand for a bit and see how you react to the sky. Of course, it's better for us not to waste time, but it will be extremely unpleasant if at the crucial moment you are unable to fight."
Fyodor screwed the filter into the gas mask and pulled it over his head. He had previously put on a gas mask for fun, but now it was the only barrier against the poisoned air of the surface. And Fyodor touched his face with his hands, checking whether the rubber was tightly attached to it. Meanwhile, the sentries opened the door of the hermetic seal so that a person could get in, and Fyodor was about to stick his head in there, but Mongol put his hand on his shoulder, forcing him to look back. "Put this on or it will burn your eyes out. How will you fight?" Yes. A nuclear war had rolled back progress by centuries, and people could no longer exterminate each other in one fell swoop. But still, this war would not lead to anything good in any case. The company went out into the lobby and, passing through the broken turnstiles, approached the exit. The Mongol carefully looked out, quickly looked around. Then he went out and gestured that they could go. Fyodor went outside, and the light cut into his eyes, which were covered by half-lowered dark glasses after all. It was not in vain that Mongol warned them about this. However, this did not prevent him from being amazed by the picture he saw. Abandoned and destroyed 5-story buildings with cracked walls stood along the street. It was late spring, and the wind drove a light ripple through the puddles. The asphalt here and there was overgrown with green moss. And then, unable to resist, Fyodor looked at the sky. The low gray sky was covered with clouds, but through rare gaps a stream of sunlight poured to the ground, which is why the destroyed city shone. As far as Fyodor could judge, it was early morning now. The clouds on one end of the horizon were colored red. At that moment, Lyoka also looked at the sky in fascination, and, having lost coordination, staggered so that Fyodor had to hold him back. Then, when the guy got used to it, the squad moved along the street. Fyodor walked and looked around, looking with all his eyes at the majestic dead city. Everything was going calmly, perhaps even too calmly, and naturally, when Fyodor had completely relaxed, a sound was heard that he could not immediately identify. It sounded like a ringing cry, but Mongol involuntarily prompted him. "Damn seagulls! And it all started so well! Come here!" Fyodor couldn't help but look at the sky. Huge creatures were flying far and above the buildings. In general, they looked like seagulls as Fyodor remembered them from childhood. The same white plumage, but the sizes were completely different. The comrades quickly ran into the gateway that Mongol pointed to and began to wait for something leaning against the wall. Fyodor didn't know how long they stood there. Mongol waited for some time after the seagulls' voices died down, looked out, and then showed that they could go. Fyodor would have even been glad that he saw such strange little animals.
if not for the fear he experienced imagining what they could do to the detachment in the open.
It won't be long. We're almost there.
Mongol encouraged the fighters. Fyodor wasn't that tired, but his face under the gas mask was sweaty and itchy, so he was glad to think that he would soon be able to take it off. And then something happened that he didn't expect at all.
Coming out from around the corner of the building onto a small open area, they saw people covered in chemical protection a few meters away.
They saw them too, and there was a second's pause, after which, without any warning, those people raised their machine guns and started shooting at them.
Fyodor, stunned by the shots, instinctively ducked, and seeing a pile of concrete debris nearby, dove behind it. At the same time, his glasses flew off, and the sun painfully bit into his eyes.
Raising himself up, he began shooting from his machine gun, almost without looking at the silhouettes of people on the other side. Realizing that this was not the case, he abruptly lay back down, and not in vain, the concrete in the place where he had been a second ago exploded into shrapnel. The shots hit his ears painfully, sweat ran down his face under the gas mask, and when he jumped for cover, he hit his knee painfully.
The sunny spring day turned into a real hell. When his eyes got used to it a little, Fyodor glanced at his comrades and was horrified. Lyoka was squeezing his shoulder with his palm. His fingers were stained with blood. He tried to lift the machine gun with one hand, but he couldn't. The Mongol was sitting behind a concrete slab not far from Fyodor, and his leg was unnaturally bent. The asphalt underneath was smeared with blood.
"Looks like the bitches broke a bone!"
Mongol shouted through the gunfire as Fyodor crawled closer.
"Fuck them!"
Fyodor didn't understand what that meant, but then Mongol thrust a grenade into his hands. It was a pre-war grenade. Fyodor knew that some stalkers took a homemade one, made by folk craftsmen on their trips, and such a pre-war grenade was an expensive pleasure. Sticking his machine gun out of the shelter, Fyodor fired a short burst to intimidate, and imagining how their enemies lay under fire, he decided to do so. Pulling the pin from the grenade, he straightened up to his full height, simultaneously throwing the grenade, and immediately expecting to be riddled with bullets, he rushed back into the shelter. There was a thunderous explosion, and everything went quiet for a while. Then suddenly shots rang out again, and then a terrible scream was heard, as if someone was being cut. Fyodor looked out carefully and saw the reason for the confusion. The noise attracted some huge gorilla-like mutants. Their skin, covered with tufts of bristles, was blistered, and they made terrible barking sounds and dealt with their enemies. The enemy of my enemy, Fyodor thought inappropriately, realizing that in this situation, the saying simply did not apply. The station vestibule was a few meters away, but getting over them became an impossible task. Fyodor looked at his comrades in indecision. Lyoka, seeing what had happened there, fell into a stupor, and Mongol threw off his gas mask, exposing his bald head and, gritting his teeth, endured the pain. "Fedya, I'll cover you, come on, grab the kid and run from here," Mongol said when Fyodor was closer, but Fyodor was not going to leave him. Throwing something unintelligible, he grabbed him by the arm and with difficulty lifted the commander's carcass. At that moment he realized that Mongol was right. Running to the vestibule was in itself an audacity, because the mutants, eating their enemies, could easily switch to them, who were some miserable 200 meters away. It was impossible to get across the open area unnoticed, and crawling at a snail's pace while dragging the commander on yourself was pure suicide. Fyodor was about to carefully put Mongol on the ground, but suddenly Leka came up from the other side and put his healthy shoulder under him to help hold the commander upright. Confused, Fyodor did not do what he intended, and they dragged Mongol to the station. Those were terrible minutes. Fyodor did not turn around as they walked to the lobby. every second expecting that now the huge carcass of one of the mutants would fly at him and crush him. But this did not happen. They went down the escalator for an endless time, trying not to disturb Mongol's injured leg, who, gritting his teeth, hissed in pain. A couple of times they almost tumbled down, stumbling on the shaky steps. The hermetic seal opened for an incredibly long time when they did not want to let them in, despite the cries that there were wounded here, and demanded a password that no one knew. In the end, Mongol, who was conscious only by force of will, told them the password, and they were able to enter the station.
Despite the fact that they seemed not to believe them, doctors with a stretcher were already waiting for them at the entrance. The commander, who had lost consciousness after finding himself under the arches of the station, was carried away, and Lyoka, supported under his healthy shoulder, was led away towards the hospital. Having washed off the radioactive dust from the chemical protection and handed over the OZK for storage, they did not take away his weapons, citing martial law. Fyodor wanted to inspect the station and catch his breath, but he was not allowed to. Immediately, some unfamiliar man in camouflage took him to a small room and asked him for a long time about what had happened on the surface. He scolded him for not being able to say with certainty that those people were saboteurs from the Red Line. In the end, Fyodor was still released, having written out a coupon to the local canteen.
He felt lousy at heart. And on the way to the canteen, Fyodor briefly inspected the station. The capital was not only the administrative center of their community, but also the only station from which one could transfer to the Red Line. Rich and shining in normal times, it now gave a frightening impression the war was felt here like nowhere else. Where tents used to stand, there were now barricades. Here and there, potholes from bullets were visible. The transfer to the Red Line suffered the most, of course. At one glance at it, it was obvious that the first battle had already taken place. The passage was completely barricaded and covered with barbed wire. Fighters were on duty at the barricades, and a large-caliber machine gun was aimed at the enemy. Here and there, traces of wiped blood were visible in the cracks of the tiles covering the floor. Looking closely, Fyodor saw that dried shreds were hanging on the barbed wire. He guessed what it was, but he did not want to think about it. Having found the canteen, which remained in the same place where it had been before, although the tables had disappeared somewhere, he received a coupon for a bowl of thin porridge with mushrooms. Having sat down on the remaining bench in the corner of the platform, he ate it without much appetite. Of course, thoughts of the past day, or rather half of it, were spinning in his head. Here he was lying in bed at home, and now he was sitting alone, not knowing what to do, at the station that had turned into a future battlefield. Not knowing where to put the bowl now, he decided to return to the canteen and return it, and then go into the tunnel leading towards his house. If the sentries don't stop him, he'll get there on foot in about an hour. But if they do stop him, then he'll go to war. Chapter 3. War. But this plan was not destined to happen. On the way to the dining room, Fyodor was called out by an unknown man. His face seemed vaguely familiar to Fyodor, but he could not remember where he had seen him. "Are you Fyodor Shestakov?" Fyodor nodded affirmatively. "Your commander has regained consciousness and wants to see you." And they went towards the field hospital, which was located in one of the utility rooms of the left tunnel. Entering, Fyodor immediately saw Mongol lying on a bed. Some board was bandaged to his leg. They shook hands. "Fedya, you are certainly a daredevil. Back then, up there, I didn't think we would make it. The situation on that square was too bad. I would have given you a medal for your bravery, but as you understand, we don't have any medals." Fyodor felt pleased by the words of praise. He only now thought how lucky they were that everyone remained alive. The Mongol continued. "But there is good news about your appointment. I already managed to talk to the local general, and he became interested when he found out that you were one of those guys who drove the handcar. The thing is that they assigned it to some idiot who, having accelerated, flew into the station, knocking down 2 sentries and maiming 1, so the vacancy became available, especially for a person who knows the business like you. So take a little rest and go to the platform in the neighboring tunnel. Having said goodbye, Fyodor left the hospital. Suddenly he remembered that he had not found out how Leka was doing. But he did not want to go back, and having climbed onto the platform, Fyodor wandered towards the opposite tunnel. When he approached the trolley, he was immediately called out. "Are you dachshund? We've been waiting for you for a long time. We've screwed up the whole schedule." Accompanied by curses, Fyodor stepped into the trolley and stood at the wheel.
It was a motor trolley. The starter clicked, the engine started, and Fyodor pressed the steering wheel to set it in motion. While they were driving, he glanced at the cargo. There were a lot of medicines, food, and, what surprised Fyodor, cartridges. Why take cartridges away from the front line, he thought with bewilderment. Not detained by the patrol, which had apparently been warned in advance, Fyodor drove into the station. There were a lot of people on the platform. It seemed even the air had thinned out. Now it was clear where the entire population of the capital had gone. Fyodor did not linger at this station for long. One heavy-set man dragged several bales of things, and the rest was apparently destined for Fyodor's home station. When the darkness of the tunnel dissolved in the light of the station lights, and the trolley smoothly pulled up to the platform, the changes at the station were immediately apparent. In the morning, everything looked as usual, but now a heavy atmosphere reigned at the station. As in the capital, many tents had been removed, and the wounded were lying right on the platform. Doctors were running fussily between them. Groans could be heard. While the loaders were unloading the trolley, Fyodor decided to take a short walk, and the more he walked, the more alarm grew. There was too much destruction. Having intercepted some young guy hurrying somewhere, Fyodor asked him what had happened here. "There was a war here," the guy answered angrily, after which he added, "Red. Bitches. Attacked from the surface. They called themselves stalkers, and as soon as we opened the Herm, the massacre began. We repelled the attack, but many of our people died, especially the civilians. It's a pity." No longer listening to the guy who had started talking, Fyodor rushed to run along the platform, sensing that something irreparable had happened. Approaching his house, or rather what was left of it, he saw a pile of rubble and wanted to rush to where Ekaterina's tent was, but someone immediately intercepted him. It was Seti. He was holding a notebook with a pencil in his hand, and judging by the expression on his face, he was about to say something. Fyodor stopped. "Fedya, I don't know what to say in such situations, so I'll say it straight. Katya, she's dead." With these words, something broke in Fedor's soul. He couldn't believe what he heard. After a couple of unbearable seconds of silence for Seti, he asked in a dull voice, "Where is she? I have to see her." Fyodor didn't know what to do. His world was crushed by cruel reality and torn to pieces. How could this happen? How could this happen? "You better not see this," gray-haired warned him unsuccessfully. His first words were like a knife in the heart. What he said now felt like this knife was twisted in the wound. What happened to her that now, even Fyodor, with slight surprise, felt a long-forgotten feeling, as if he was about to cry. Noticing this, gray-haired realized that if he did not do anything now, then it would be difficult to bring the guy to his senses, and he grabbed him by the shoulder and squeezed him tightly.
Fyodor, listen to the order. Right now you need to return to the trolley and take the recovered soldiers to the capital. If you lose heart now, the same could happen to everyone.
Sedik's words did not console Fyodor at all, but he turned around and staggered towards the trolley. He still could not believe what had happened. Several young guys stepped into the trolley with him. During the ride they had a conversation, from which it was clear that the Reds had captured our outlying station, which goes behind the capital, but at the same time ours had captured one of their outer stations, and Prokofiev was planning to use it as a springboard for a future offensive. Of course, when we take back our station. Then they argued for a long time about who attacked first. One claimed that we attacked, and the other that they did. "What the hell difference does it make?" Fyodor thought languidly. "The worst has already happened.
Having arrived at the next station, a couple more people got into the trolley. Among them was Sipley. Seeing his friend, he smiled. But then, turning gloomy, he said, "Kate."
I know,
Fyodor interrupted him.
I'm very sorry. Hold on.
Was all Victor could say, after which there was silence. The guys discussing politics moved on to another topic and smiled. But after a short dialogue between Fyodor and Sipley, they silently fell silent, not daring to interfere with someone else's grief. Arriving at the capital, he was taken off the trolley and sent along with other soldiers. There they listened to a plan from some commander that while they were thinking about coming at us from the rear, we had prepared a bridgehead in their rear.
They planned to attack in two groups. One main group would go through the tunnels to their next station, and the group in which Fyodor, Sipley, and a few others were would blow up the hermetic seal. As intelligence reported, he was holding on there by a thread, and suddenly attack from the rear. Fyodor was surprised to find Leka among his group. The doc said that there was a lot of blood because of some crap.
Otherwise it's okay. He bandaged it, gave me some pills, and we can go into battle.
Leka said cheerfully in response to his friend's silent question, after which he demonstratively bent his arm and winced.
No, I shoot with my other hand, so we'll get through.
Having entered the armory, everyone again put on chemical protection gear. Fyodor had already forgotten that he had a machine gun hanging behind his back all this time. The commander began to give a lecture on the dangers of sunlight, agoraphobia, and the like.
Fyodor had heard all this from Mongol, as it seemed to him, in the same words.
Fyodor refused dark glasses, and the commander did not insist. Having reached the surface, their squad moved to the position. Fyodor at first grimaced, daylight hit his eyes with renewed force, but quickly stopped paying attention to it. Then he mechanically walked, followed commands, although they walked without incident. True, perhaps Fyodor, absorbed in heavy thoughts, simply did not notice the danger. Several times the squad stopped waiting for something, and once, for some reason, they went into some entrance filled with cobwebs, after which they immediately left from there. He covered a greater distance with the squad than in Mongol's group, but Fyodor became interested in what was happening only when they approached the descent to the enemy station.
Having inspected the area and found no traces of an ambush, the commander reported his readiness to another group, and several people went down to plant the charge. Having checked the weapons, the squad sat down in the middle of the escalators, waiting for the signal. Then Fyodor began to worry, although it seemed to him that he had nothing to lose, but the upcoming battle still caused concern. Then he felt anger. After all, it was they, the Reds, who destroyed his native station. It was they who were to blame for everything. When the commander received the order to advance on the radio, an explosion thundered, and a hot cloud of dust burst out of the dungeon to meet the squad. Fyodor's ears were blocked, and he heard only a ringing sound, but seeing that everyone was rushing down, he also ran. Having almost fallen into the gaping hole formed by the collapse of several steps of the escalator, Fyodor jumped down to where the hermetic gate had stood before, and immediately found himself in the thick of the battle. The explosion broke the hermetic gates out of the wall, and they swung inward. In the passage, he saw barricades of sandbags and several people behind them. Having fired a short burst while running, he stood to the side of the passage. Someone fired from an underbarrel grenade launcher, but Fyodor barely heard the explosion. While they were running along the passage, his hearing partially returned to him, and when they reached the steps leading to the platform, the station was in full view. Leaning out from behind the toppled barricades, Fyodor began shooting at the people running below, but then discovered with surprise that the station was not ready for battle. On the platform at the entrance to the tunnel, women and children were crowded together. Some of them jumped off the platform and ran into the tunnel.
All the men flocked to the tunnels from the other side, from where the second group of blues was now advancing. The entrances to the tunnels were sealed with hastily thrown together barricades of various construction waste, seasoned with intertwined barbed wire. But apparently the second group had even more explosives, and they made breaches in the defense. Then there was a fight. Fyodor did not really understand what was happening. Deafening explosions thundered, bullets whistled. At first it seemed that ours were winning. The enemy soldiers were rushing around the platform, not knowing where to go. They were being showered with lead from all sides. But then Fyodor noticed that there were also quite a few dead and wounded among his group, including the commander.
And the surviving enemies hid behind the barricades on the platform and showered them with lead. At some point it became clear that the attack had stalled. There was no longer any fighting visible from the tunnels, and their group was being fired upon non-stop, not allowing them to stick their heads out. At some point, someone from the group turned around and ran. Everyone ran after him. Some, in the heat of battle, managed to take off their gas mask, but Fyodor somehow managed to forget about it and was now glad that he could run to the surface without slowing down. But having flown over the barricade at the open hermetic seal, the survivors turned around and began shooting at the enemies who had rushed to pursue them. Fyodor fired without really aiming, and immediately dove down. This simple reflex had saved his life more than once. Someone fell nearby, clutching Fyodor's clothes with his hand, pulling him along, but immediately letting go. Fyodor glanced at him and noticed painfully familiar red hair.
Horse had been Fyodor's friend practically since the very day the old world ceased to exist. They had spent their entire childhood together and remained best friends in adulthood. And now, by chance, they were fighting side by side with those who had destroyed their home. Victor was wounded. His left hand with crooked fingers clutched his stomach. His fingers were smeared with blood. Leaning on his machine gun, he rose with difficulty, standing on one knee. Removing his hand from the wound, raised the machine gun, and began shooting at the enemies. His face expressed a terrible grimace of pain and tension. Blood flowed from the cut wound on his forehead, filling his eyes. Fyodor wanted to do or say something, but at that moment, one of the bullets simply blew off half of Horse's head. Stunned by what had happened, Fyodor continued to watch in a stupor as his body fell to the floor and convulsed several more times. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to kill those who did this. Without even thinking about caution, Fyodor jumped up, raising his machine gun, ready to kill as many scum as would crawl out of this damned station.
Fyodor fired without really aiming and immediately dove down.
This simple reflex had saved his life many times. Someone fell nearby, clutching Fyodor's clothes with his hand, pulling him along, but immediately let go. Fyodor glanced at him and noticed painfully familiar red hair. Horse had been Fyodor's friend practically since the very day the old world ceased to exist. They spent their entire childhood together and remained best friends in adulthood. And now, by chance, they were fighting side by side with those who destroyed their home. Victor was wounded. He was holding his stomach with his left hand, with crooked fingers. His fingers were smeared with blood. Leaning on the machine gun, he rose with difficulty. Standing on one knee, removing his hand from the wound, raised the machine gun and began shooting at the enemies. His face expressed a terrible grimace of pain and tension. Blood flowed from the cut wound on his forehead, filling his eyes.
Fyodor wanted to do or say something, but at that moment, one of the bullets simply blew off half of Horse's head. Stunned by what had happened, Fyodor continued to watch in a stupor as his body fell to the floor and convulsed several more times. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to kill those who did this. Without even thinking about caution, Fyodor jumped up, raising his machine gun, ready to kill as many scum as would crawl out of this damned station. But his impulse was cut short before it really began. He felt a powerful blow that threw him back a couple of meters.
Several enemy bullets hit their target at once. It knocked out his breath. Fyodor, feeling the taste of blood in his mouth, tried to breathe in, but he couldn't. A terrible pain pierced his body, and, unable to bear it, the crazy world around him went out. Some in the heat of battle managed to take off their gas masks, but Fyodor somehow managed to forget about it and was now glad that he could run to the surface without slowing down. But having flown over the barricade at the open hermetic seal, the survivors turned around and began shooting at the enemies who had rushed to pursue them. Fyodor fired without really aiming and immediately dove down. This simple reflex had saved his life many times. Someone fell nearby, clutching Fyodor's clothes with his hand, pulling him along, but immediately let go. Fyodor glanced at him and noticed painfully familiar red hair. Horse had been Fyodor's friend practically since the very day the old world ceased to exist. They spent their entire childhood together and remained best friends in adulthood, and now, by chance, they were fighting side by side with those who destroyed their home.
Victor was wounded.
He was holding his stomach with his left hand, with crooked fingers. His fingers were smeared with blood. Leaning on the machine gun, he rose with difficulty. Standing on one knee, removing his hand from the wound, raised the machine gun and began shooting at the enemies. His face expressed a terrible grimace of pain and tension. Blood flowed from the cut wound on his forehead, filling his eyes. Fyodor wanted to do or say something, but at that moment, one of the bullets simply blew off half of Horse's head. Stunned by what had happened, Fyodor continued to watch in a stupor as his body fell to the floor and convulsed several more times. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to kill those who did this. Without even thinking about caution, Fyodor jumped up, raising his machine gun, ready to kill as many scum as would crawl out of this damned station. But his impulse was cut short before it really began. He felt a powerful blow that threw him back a couple of meters. Several enemy bullets hit their target at once. It knocked out his breath. Fyodor, feeling the taste of blood in his mouth, tried to breathe in, but he couldn't. A terrible pain pierced his body, and unable to bear it, the crazy world around him went out. Removing his hand from the wound, he raised his machine gun and began shooting at the enemies. His face expressed a terrible grimace of pain and tension. Blood flowed from the cut wound on his forehead, filling his eyes. Fyodor wanted to do or say something, but at that moment, one of the bullets simply blew off half of Horse's head. Stunned by what had happened, Fyodor continued to watch in a stupor as his body fell to the floor and convulsed several more times. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to kill those who did this. Without even thinking about caution, Fyodor jumped up, raising his machine gun, ready to kill as many scum as would crawl out of this damn station. But his impulse was cut short before it really began. He felt a powerful blow that threw him back a couple of meters. Several enemy bullets immediately reached their target. It knocked out his breath. Fyodor, feeling the taste of blood in his mouth, tried to inhale, but he could not. A terrible pain pierced the body, and unable to bear it, the crazy world around went out. Removing his hand from the wound, he raised his machine gun and began shooting at the enemies. His face expressed a terrible grimace of pain and tension. Blood flowed from the cut wound on his forehead, filling his eyes. Fyodor wanted to do or say something, but at that moment, one of the bullets simply blew off half of Horse's head. Stunned by what had happened, Fyodor continued to watch in a stupor as his body fell to the floor and convulsed several more times.
He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to kill those who did this. Without even thinking about caution, Fyodor jumped up, raising his machine gun, ready to kill as many scum as would crawl out of this damned station. But his impulse was cut short before it really began. He felt a powerful blow that threw him back a couple of meters.
Several enemy bullets immediately reached their target. It knocked out his breath. Fyodor, feeling the taste of blood in his mouth, tried to inhale, but he could not. A terrible pain pierced the body and, unable to bear it, the crazy world around went out. Chapter 4. Apocalypse. Fyodor was walking somewhere with Vitya Sleptsov, nicknamed Sipli. It was at some station. People were walking around. Stopping at one of the columns, the friends grabbed the stucco for some reason and climbed up. The plaster on the column was rather shabby. In one place, Fyodor stared at a brown spot formed by moisture. Cracks from it diverged in different directions. Looking closely, he noticed with surprise some movement. And looking closer, realized that he was looking at an anthill. Millions of tiny insects were swarming, climbing over each other, and intertwining into an endless mass of legs and chelicerae. Just looking at them made your skin itch. They looked like maggots swarming in a rotting corpse that had lain in water for a month under the scorching sun. Emerging from the heavy embrace of feverish delirium, Fyodor found himself lying on a bed. He was in an unfamiliar room that he had never seen before. He was shivering. In the next corner there was another bed, shining with a bare iron frame. Fyodor stirred and felt some foreign object under his arm. It turned out to be a thermometer. Turning it in his hands, Fyodor saw that the column stopped at the number 39.8. This is bad, he thought, and began to remember what had happened. Remembering the picture of the battle, he also remembered the fate of his friend. Moisture welled up in his eyes. Then someone entered the room and unceremoniously took the thermometer. Looking at it, the unknown person went somewhere. Fyodor waited for a very long time and, deciding that they had forgotten about him, he tried to get up. And then he felt incredible weakness. His body was cottony, and he collapsed, exhausted, back into bed. Soon the unknown person returned with a glass of water and some pills. Fyodor drank the medicine and was able to barely audibly say, "Thank you." "If you survive, you will owe me," said an unfamiliar male voice, after which the unknown person left, closing the door. The room was in semi-darkness, and Fyodor was unable to look around properly. "Okay, it's not that bad," he convinced himself. "At least they are treating me, and I can't do anything myself now anyway, so there is no need to worry about it." In the following days, he got worse. His temperature almost never dropped below 40. He was constantly vomiting. Now he almost never stopped delirious. Sometimes he dreamed that none of this had happened, and he was lying at home. But more often he saw the war. He dreamed how he was walking through a tunnel, flooded with dim emergency lights. In the blood-red glow, he saw that the entire tunnel was covered with intricate barbed wire. Trying to pass, he constantly lost his balance and clung to it. The barbed wire dug into his face. He tried to free himself by tearing off his skin and only getting tangled in it even more, like a fly in a web. When he woke up, he took pills. Strangers changed his bandages. Sometimes they helped him get up and walk to the toilet at the end of the corridor, after which, exhausted, he went to bed and continued his unequal fight with the fever. At some point, Fyodor noticed that no one came to him for a very long time. He began to fear that they decided that it was impossible to save him and left him to die. Gathering all his strength, he walked around the place where he was but did not meet anyone. The place was a corridor and several rooms of different sizes. At one end of the corridor, he found something like a hermetic seal, and it seemed to him that he heard a sound several times while lying in bed that could have been the sound of them closing. He had hoped that they would return, and he went to bed. They did not return. Almost all the time Fyodor was tossing and turning in delirium, he dreamed that those people came into his room, or that he suddenly discovered a door in his room that led him to a station filled with people. Waking up, he did not stop delirious. It seemed to him that he heard steps in the corridor or quiet voices in the neighboring rooms. Then he, sick, on disobedient legs, got up and staggered around the shelter for a long time trying to find where they were sitting. In moments of clarity, he drank pills left on the nightstand near his bed and measured his temperature, which did not want to go down. Once, waking up, he felt that he was going to die right now. He wanted to take the pills from the nightstand, but he did not have enough strength to even move his hand. Gathering all the conceivable and inconceivable strength that remained to him, he still managed to incredibly slowly reach for the pills. Then he woke up for real. His head was buzzing, his back ached, his throat was sore. Somewhere in the corner of the room the air was hissing. Thinking that the dream was close to the truth, Fyodor measured his temperature, 36.8. At first he did not believe it, and looked at the thermometer for a long time, convinced that he was right. He began to laugh. He had not felt such relief for a long time. The following days he remained in the shelter. Fyodor continued to take the pills until they ran out, but by that time he had already grown strong enough to hope to do without them. He began to get out of bed more often, and, noticing that he had lost a lot of weight during his illness, decided to force himself to eat dry biscuits found in one of the rooms that apparently served as a kitchen. Having grown a little stronger, he risked eating a can of stewed meat found there. He continued to live in the shelter, as he called it, not knowing what to do next or even where he was. The fact that those people never returned ruled out the option of being captured by the Reds. The bitterness of loss still weighed on his heart like a dead weight. But while Fyodor was struggling with the fever, enough time had passed for him to be able to think sensibly again. Over time, he almost stopped being angry at the Reds. Remembering that battle, he realized that then he had shot at civilians just as they had shot at him on the territory of the Blues. In fact, he began to blame everything on Ruslan Bekarev, the leader of the Reds, and Nikolai Prokofiev, the leader of the Blues. Still suffering from fever, Fyodor thought angrily that, most likely, neither ours nor theirs wanted to fight. His Fyodor, in fact, was simply presented with the fact that the war had begun and thrown into battle. Most likely, the Reds had something similar. Remembering the events preceding his injury, he tried to understand where he was wounded. On his body, he found many different healed scratches and scars, and he could not say with certainty which of them were just scratches and which were the wounds that almost cost him his life. He was surprised to find his things dumped under the bed. A backpack, a gas mask, even his pistol with a holster remained in place, although the machine gun disappeared without a trace. A sports jacket, over which there was a bulletproof vest and chemical protection. Actually, by the holes in the chemical protection and the dents in the bulletproof vest, he was able to determine that 2 bullets had hit him in the torso. One dent was in the stomach area, the other was a little higher on the chest. However, there must have been something else, because an open wound is needed for an infection to penetrate the body. He thought about the taste of blood that he felt before losing consciousness, and came to the conclusion that he most likely just bit his tongue. When he had already gotten stronger, he began to think about going to the surface and finally finding out where he was. However, chance pushed him in this decision. One day the light went out. Fyodor, bumping into walls, returned to the room with the bed and finding a headlamp in his backpack, fortunately the battery was not dead, went to the room with the generator. Fyodor was not a master in repairing equipment, and when nothing happened when he pressed the start button, he ran out of ideas for repairs. Then he hopefully thought that perhaps the fuel had simply run out. Knocking on the tank, he heard a sound that fully confirmed this theory. However, the joy about this ended immediately as soon as he searched the entire room and did not find a single canister. Without thinking twice, he began to get ready, shining a flashlight in front of him. Unfortunately, he had to abandon the bulletproof vest. The dents painfully dug into his body when he tried to fasten it. Gathering his courage, he answered the valve and opened the shutter. Walking along the vestibule, he began to climb the steps, which ended rather quickly. Further on, the road was blocked by something between a door and a hatch. Light was seeping through the cracks between the flaps. Throwing one of them back, light hit Fyodor in the face. He wanted to close it back, but stopped, and squinting his eyes, began to move the pistol, expecting an attack. However, nothing like that happened. Fyodor's eyes got used to the bright daylight a little, and he found himself on the surface. Summer was blazing outside. Fyodor immediately felt hot in his jacket, chemical protection, and gas mask. He even wondered if he really needed all this protection. But then he remembered that without a dosimeter, he would not be able to feel the radiation until it was too late. Turning around, he saw that he had crawled out of some basement which was apparently a bomb shelter. Right in front of him, on the asphalt, lay a machine gun. Its metal parts had already begun to rust, and right underneath it were clearly visible traces of crusted blood washed away by the rain. Apparently this is all that is left of the people who saved me, Fyodor thought with annoyance. Why did they save him? How? Who were they? Perhaps he would never know. Without picking up the machine gun, which was clearly damaged by the weather, Fyodor looked around. The basement was in a gateway between two houses. On one side there was a yard with some dead trees without leaves, and on the other, a street with rusty carcasses. Fyodor had absolutely no idea where he was, and after walking a little along the street turned right, and decided to stick to that direction. The street names that remained, here and there, meant nothing to him. Fyodor did not let go of the gun and constantly looked around. He did not know how to behave on the surface. Both times he was accompanied, but now he was forced to go alone, relying on luck and intuition. Once he noticed movement in the window of the house. Fyodor peered there for a long time, pointing the gun until he saw that in the room, on the wall opposite the street, a huge spider was sitting across the entire wall. Its body was half the size of a man, and its thin paws rested on the corners of the room. Fyodor shuddered and quickly walked on. Having reached the next intersection, the street seemed familiar to him. For some time he remembered and then realized that somewhere here he, Mongol, and Lyaka were hiding from the seagulls. Happy that he finally knew where he was, Fyodor wanted to go towards the lobby of the capital. But some creatures began to crawl out of the bushes and gateways.
Fyodor was able to recognize them as dogs. They were larger than those that could sometimes be found at the stations. Their jaws were clearly larger. Fyodor backed away, raising his pistol. There were a lot of them, and he mentally counted how many rounds were in the clip, and realized that even if he didn't miss, he wouldn't have enough rounds. Stupidly not finding a vest among his things, Fyodor shoved the spare clips for the pistol into his backpack, not thinking that he wouldn't have time to get them out in battle. Meanwhile, the dogs were slowly walking around him from different sides. Some of them were baring their teeth and growling. Fyodor didn't know what to do and did something stupid. He rushed to run into the nearest gateway, although his brain understood that they were faster than a man in a gas mask. But he was incredibly lucky. Running into the yard, he saw a square ventilation shaft and rushed towards it. Having broken off a flimsy, rusty grate, Fyodor did not dare to dive in, and turning around, began to quickly descend along the brackets. The jaws of one of the dogs snapped millimeters from the place where his face had been a moment ago. Enraged, Fyodor wanted to shoot, but changed his mind and continued to descend. They continued to poke their heads into the ventilation shaft hatch, but fortunately, the mutated dogs had not learned to climb ladders. In a hurry, Fyodor missed the bracket and fell, hitting his back painfully against the wall, although the height was not high, and his feet immediately touched the bottom. From the stress he had experienced, his hands were shaking slightly.
Turning on the flashlight, Fyodor saw the only way out in the form of a low manhole. Dropping to all fours, Fyodor crawled forward. Inopportunely, he remembered how many times Sipley had told him about various manholes. Maybe if Fyodor had remembered more, he would not have to go at random now. At some point, the manhole broke off, and shining the light down, Fyodor realized that this was one of the tunnels of his native metro. Damn, it's too high, Fyodor thought with annoyance. But there was no other way out. Having examined the walls below him and chosen where he could jump without fear of running into any pins, he hung on his hands and jumped. He landed not very successfully, slightly bruising his heels. Having got his bearings by the place where he was going down into the ventilation shaft, Fyodor thought that he was in a tunnel between the capital and the neighboring station. After thinking for a bit, he walked briskly towards the capital. He could not shake off the warm and slightly exciting feeling that he was returning home. Although in his mind he of course understood that most likely the war was not over yet, but already around one of the turns of the tunnel, he met a strange procession. Several people in their underwear were standing facing the wall. One man with a short haircut and a machine gun, noticing Fyodor, pointed the barrel at him with a flashlight attached to it. His hands were shaking slightly from the stress he had experienced. Turning on the flashlight, Fyodor saw the only way out in the form of a low manhole. Dropping to all fours, Fyodor crawled forward. Inopportunely, he remembered how many times Sipley had told him about various manholes. Maybe if Fyodor had remembered more, he wouldn't have to go at random now. At some point, the manhole ended, and shining the light down, Fyodor realized that this was one of the tunnels of his native metro. Damn, that's a bit high, Fyodor thought with annoyance, but there was no other way out. Having examined the walls beneath him and chosen where he could jump without fear of running into any pins, he hung on his hands and jumped. He landed, not very successfully, slightly bruising his heels. Orienting himself by the place where he went down into the ventilation shaft, Fyodor thought that he was in a tunnel between the capital and the neighboring station. After thinking for a bit, he walked briskly towards the capital. He couldn't shake off the warm and slightly exciting feeling that he was returning home, although he knew in his mind that the war was probably not over yet. But already around one of the turns of the tunnel he met a strange procession. Several people in their underwear were standing facing the wall. One man with a short haircut and a machine gun, noticing Fyodor, pointed the barrel at him with a flashlight attached to it. His hands were shaking slightly from the stress he had experienced. Turning on the flashlight, Fyodor saw the only way out in the form of a low manhole. Dropping to all fours, Fyodor crawled forward. Inopportunely, he remembered how many times Sipley had told him about various manholes. Maybe if Fyodor had remembered more, he wouldn't have to go at random now. At some point, the manhole ended, and shining the light down, Fyodor realized that this was one of the tunnels of his native metro. Damn, that's a bit high, Fyodor thought with annoyance. But there was no other way out. Having examined the walls beneath him and chosen where he could jump without fear of running into any pins, he hung on his hands and jumped. He landed not very successfully, slightly bruising his heels. Orienting himself by the place where he went down into the ventilation shaft, Fyodor thought that he was in a tunnel between the capital and the neighboring station. After thinking for a bit, he walked briskly towards the capital. He couldn't shake off the warm and slightly exciting feeling that he was returning home, although he knew in his mind that the war was probably not over yet. But already around one of the turns of the tunnel, he met a strange procession. Several people in their underwear were standing facing the wall. One man with a short haircut and a machine gun, noticing Fyodor, pointed the barrel at him with a flashlight attached to it.
Daksa, are you really alive?
Having said this, he lowered the barrel with the flashlight. Fyodor came closer.
You are listed as missing in action.
Who is this? Fyodor interrupted him, pointing at the half-naked people. Fyodor seemed to have seen the man somewhere, but he didn't remember his name.
What? War criminals and enemy spies?
Fedya, it's me, Lyoka. You saw everything. Tell him. Then Fyodor saw that one of the enemy spies was Lyoka, with whom he had fought side by side until he was shot. Now he looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, huge bruises on his cheek and ribs.
I didn't tell them anything. Shut up, said the man with the machine gun, and pointed the barrel towards the guy.
Fyodor suddenly leaned forward with all his might, slamming his fist into the machine gunner's face, who grabbed his broken nose with his hand.
Fyodor himself did not yet fully realize what he had done when Lyoka suddenly knocked the machine gunner down, knocking him onto the sleepers. Grabbing his head, he slammed it against the rail, and again, and again, and again. The man's head had already turned into a solid, bloody mess, but Lyoka did not even think of stopping. Fyodor, shocked by what had happened, wanted to stop the guy, but such primordial anger was red in his eyes that, frightened, Fyodor quickly walked away from this place. After walking about 200 meters, he realized with annoyance that he had gone in the wrong direction and had been walking in the opposite direction all this time. He reassured himself that no one had seen anything, and if they found the body, they would not blame him.
Fyodor felt very tired and decided to walk to the neighboring station and then come what may. He walked along the tunnel for a long time until he finally came to the checkpoint, which during his absence had turned into a real bastion. As expected, he was met with the muzzles of machine guns. He raised his hands.
Fyodor, is it really you? Said one of the sentries. Unfortunately, Fyodor didn't remember his name either. After a short meeting, they let him through. They searched him and took away all his weapons, chemical protection, gas mask. Basically, they left him in his clothes. You'll have to excuse me, but it's wartime, you know. You'll sit in the monkey house for a while and then go back to the ranks, the guard said with reference. Fyodor didn't resist. They took him to one of the utility rooms in the tunnel that leads to Fyodor's home station.
He even had a crazy idea to break free and run home. But of course it was pointless. No one and nothing was waiting for him at home. They shoved him behind bars and closed the door. Then he was overcome with anger. What the hell? He thought. So they throw me into battle, I miraculously survive, come back, and instead of honors, they put me behind bars. And then what? Against the wall like Lyoka? Fyodor didn't know how long he sat there. At first he tried to get the guard to talk, but he phlegmatically answered something like, "Not allowed." In the end, he still managed to find out from the intractable guard that Ruslan Bekarev, the leader of the Reds, was killed as a result of sabotage, but some trusted soldier immediately took over command and the war continued. Then Fyodor began to listen, and it seemed to him that shots were heard somewhere far away. Although after thinking about it, he decided that it was just a figment of his imagination.
Sitting on the bench, he even dozed off for a while.
Then the grate was opened, and he was unceremoniously dragged out. He asked what was going on, but no one answered. They went deeper into the tunnel, and Fyodor realized with horror that now he would really be shot. But at some point the procession of two machine gunners stopped, and they entered some kind of utility room. There was a chair under a lamp. There were poorly wiped traces of blood on the floor. In the room was some lanky guy whom Fyodor had never seen before. They sat him down on the chair, after which the interrogation began. He told everything as it was, but they made him repeat it over and over again, constantly dwelling on the same points. The special officer especially didn't like the moment with what happened to Fyodor after he was wounded. Then there was a long silence that was nerve-wracking, but in the end the special officer said,
What do you want me to do with you? Understand and forgive?
Well, of course.
What if you really are an enemy spy?
You know you're a good man, so naive. Let's go to the commandant. We'll decide what to do with you. After these words, they left the utility room. Now Fyodor clearly heard the sounds of a fight that was not that far away. One machine gunner pressed the barrel of his gun into Fyodor's back, and they went along the tunnel. It seemed now towards the station. Turning into another utility room, they walked along a long corridor, at the end of which there was a door guarded by 2 more machine gunners. Having briefly explained to them, the guard nodded, letting the procession into the room. Perhaps the commandant of this station, whom Fyodor knew by sight, used to sit here. But now, an elderly man dressed in brand-new camouflage was sitting at the table. "Hello, Nikolai Denisovich. They brought a spy. What should we do with him?"
It was Nikolai Prokofiev.
Fyodor had never seen him before, but the special officer called him by name, and there was no doubt. "Are you an idiot? Remove it. Of course. I'm not a spy. I can tell my whole story again." Fyodor blurted out sharply, rather out of despair, causing the machine gunners standing in different corners of the room to shudder. "Why the hell do I need to listen to your nonsense? We are at war, son, and talking to spies is short." Then he gave the signal to the special officer or machine gunners. Fyodor was simply seething with anger. Probably it was noticeable because the machine gunner standing on the right took a step forward, raising his machine gun to hit with the butt. Fyodor, without thinking, rushed at the machine gunner, slamming him into the wall. Grabbing the machine gun, he jerked it sharply, hoping to take it away. But despite the machine gunner not expecting such agility, he held the machine gun tightly and a scuffle began.
Fyodor angrily jerked the machine gun towards himself, hoping to break his fingers.
The machine gunner came to his senses and, blushing, hit Fyodor in the ear with one fist, to which Fyodor sharply moved the machine gun towards him, poking the muzzle somewhere into his teeth. Fyodor did not know that the second machine gunner had already raised his machine gun and, aiming at his back, pulled the trigger. A second before that, the guy Fyodor was fighting with stumbled, and they fell head over heels to the floor. A burst of bullets passed over them, and the special agent, who had pulled out a pistol and wanted to stop the chaos, fell dead right on top of the fighters. Fyodor was still able to snatch the machine gun from the machine gunner's hands, and turning over on his back, simultaneously removing the machine gun from the safety catch, he fired a burst at the guy who was looking dumbfounded at the special agent he had accidentally shot. At that moment, Fyodor jumped up on one knee and fired at Prokofiev, who jerked under the table, but the bullets caught up with him faster. Not believing what had happened, Fyodor hesitated, but remembering the guy from whom he had taken the machine gun, he turned around sharply and simultaneously pulled the trigger. The guy screamed briefly and the pistol shot flew millimeters from Fyodor's head, knocking concrete chips out of the ceiling. All this took no more than a couple of seconds. His ears were ringing from the gunshots. His heart was beating wildly. Fyodor understood how small his chances were, but the fact remains. Behind the door, somewhere at the station, the sounds of battle were thundering, and he stood practically unharmed in a small room with 4 corpses, one of which was the culprit of the people behind the door killing each other. A new wave of anger, like a tsunami, washed over Fyodor. What happened next he almost did not remember. Only vague images emerged in his memory. It seemed that he was hitting someone. The crunch of breaking joints was heard, then the quiet sound of a knife entering flesh, the nasty sharp smell of intestines. Fyodor was sitting in a chair at Prokofiev's table, throwing his feet up on the table. His hands and clothes were covered in blood, and he thought with annoyance that he had been wounded after all. Then Fyodor looked into the corner of the room and realized why his clothes were covered in blood. It was hard to recognize a person in what was lying in the corner. Suddenly, nausea, rolled over him, and Fyodor threw up on the floor. Could he really do this? He could. Just like any person could kill other people, just because of some thought, idea, be it an order, fear, confidence in his own rightness, or indulging in something ancient sitting in everyone's mind and awakening at special moments. Someone kills on orders, someone for profit, someone just for the adrenaline. But they all know one thing. Deep down, they like to kill. Man has empathy, compassion. Man knows how to change the world around him. We could build a beautiful world in which there would be no room for pain. Man can change the world. But man cannot change himself. The part that is responsible for destruction has always been stronger. With this thought, Fyodor took a pistol from the desk drawer. Prokofiev did not have time to use it, and throwing his head back, put it to his chin. Sharply, so as not to change his mind, Fyodor pulled the trigger. Chapter 5. Nothingness. Some incomprehensible force prevented Fyodor from pulling the trigger. His mouth was dry. He switched the safety catch with annoyance and again put the gun to his chin. After sitting like that for several long seconds, he abruptly threw the gun away. No, he would never dare to do it a second time. Nausea rose in his throat again, and he was simply shocked by the thought that he had just almost committed suicide. The sounds of the battle behind the door died down, and an ominous silence filled the room. Fyodor began to think that the corpses were silently condemning him, and he hurried out into the corridor. There were no machine gunners, and Fyodor walked unhindered to the end of the corridor, which was resting against the door. It seemed that all feelings had already burned out, and Fyodor did not care how they would greet him at the station. The door was not closed, but something was preventing it from being opened. Fyodor leaned his shoulder and discovered that the man lying on the floor was preventing the door from being opened. There was a gaping hole in his forehead, his mouth was open, his eyes rolled back, revealing the whites. Fyodor opened the door and moved his legs, so he was now lying in an unnatural position, with one of his arms raised up, as if waving in greeting. Fyodor felt very weak. Stepping over the body, he walked towards the station. The closer Fyodor got to it, the more bodies he encountered on his way. At the station itself, Fyodor climbed onto the platform and was horrified. The entire station was littered with corpses. Traces of battle were visible everywhere, but the density of the bodies was so dense that there was nowhere to put a foot. Several columns had been destroyed by the explosion. A charred armored rail car was smoking, frozen in half the tracks. Fyodor still felt sick. Turning around, he staggered towards his native station, logically deciding that the incapacitated population had been evacuated there. Having walked most of the way, he came across a fresh blockage and ran back. It was a long, terrible day. Fyodor ran like crazy from station to station, overcoming the stretches, getting out of breath, hobbling along on foot, and then running again. He crossed the front line without any problems and went to surrender to the red line. He walked around it all. But at all the stations, he saw the same thing. Corpses, 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 corpses. Bloody corpses. No, he still met living people along the way, but they were all mortally wounded. One man had his leg torn off and half his face torn off. Another was lying curled up in the stretch. Fyodor tripped over him in the dark and then thanked fate that the guy was already unconscious. A piece of shrapnel had ripped open his belly, and his intestines had fallen out. The most alive person Fyodor met was a young guy with a shot through his arm, leaning against the wall. Perhaps his wound was not fatal, but as soon as Fyodor rushed to help, the boy looked at him angrily, pulled the pin out of the grenade, tried to throw it at Fyodor. However, he apparently did it with his wounded hand, because the grenade flew at most half a meter,
and fell on the floor at the boy's feet. He rushed to the side, but the explosion left him no chance. Fyodor, lying on the floor, got up and walked on. He did not want to see what was left of that man. Deathly silence reigned everywhere. When Fyodor froze, he heard music playing somewhere, and sometimes someone screaming terribly. But no matter how much Fyodor tried to follow the sound, it constantly moved away. In the utility rooms of the tunnels, in the sections themselves, and at the stations, Fyodor found not only the bodies of soldiers, women, and children suffered the same fate. In the tunnels, he sometimes scared off flocks of squeaking rats. Apparently feeling that the danger had passed, they began to crawl out of their holes. Now they have definitely become the rightful owners of the metro. At one of the stations, Fyodor came across a shower in a utility room. Laundry was drying nearby, and he stopped to wash off the sticky blood and changed clothes, finding something more or less in size. After that, exhausted, he collapsed in a utility room with a generator from which heat emanated. Despite the universal fatigue, he could not fall asleep for a long time. And when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed all night that he was lying on the platform with corpses. When he woke up, he already knew what to do. Grabbing a canister of diesel, he went to the surviving armory. Having collected everything he needed, he reached the station where he killed Prokofiev. On the way, he thought about not closing the hermetic seal behind him. But then the thought arose that someone could have survived. However, this dilemma resolved itself. It was impossible to close the hermetic seal from the outside. Fyodor went to the surface and walked along the remembered street to look for the bunker, where he was brought wounded after the battle where Horse was killed. Having reasoned sensibly, he decided that he could not live in the metro. On the surface, it was a sunny, fine day. The trees, twisted by radiation, rustled with lush green leaves. White clouds crawled across the sky. And somewhere, mutants were calling to each other, with inexplicable sounds. And nothing spoke of the tragedy that had unfolded underground. Only his soul was lousy. Having reached the shelter without incident, the first thing Fyodor did was refuel the generator. When he pressed the starter, it confidently puffed, and the darkness dissipated into light. Without much desire, Fyodor had a snack of the canned food that remained here, and lay down on the bed. With gloomy triumph, he summed up. With their joint efforts, humanity had failed natural selection. At least within the city, there were no more people left. He was just an atavism, a kind of mammoth, which was unlikely to exist for long. And he could not restore the human race alone, no matter how hard he wanted to. Now the city, and possibly the whole world, belonged to mutants. After that, he lived another 40 years more than he had planned. There was laundry drying nearby, and he stopped to wash off the sticky blood and changed clothes, finding something more or less in size. After that, exhausted, he collapsed in a utility room with a generator that was emitting heat. Despite the universal fatigue, he could not fall asleep for a long time. And when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed all night that he was lying on the platform with corpses. When he woke up, he already knew what to do. Grabbing a canister of diesel fuel, he went to the surviving armory. Having collected everything he needed, he reached the station where he killed Prokofiev. On the way, he thought about not closing the hermetic seal behind him. But then the thought arose that someone could have survived. However, this dilemma resolved itself. It was impossible to close the hermetic seal from the outside. Fyodor came to the surface and walked along the remembered street to look for the bunker where he was brought wounded after the battle where Siploy was killed. Having reasoned sensibly, he decided that he could not live in the metro. On the surface, it was a sunny, fine day. The trees, twisted by radiation, rustled with lush green leaves. White clouds crawled across the sky. Somewhere, mutants called to each other with inexplicable sounds.
and nothing spoke of the tragedy that had unfolded underground. Only his soul was nasty. Having reached the shelter without incident, the first thing Fyodor did was fill up the generator. When he pressed the starter, it confidently puffed, and the darkness dissipated with light. Without much desire, Fyodor had a snack of the canned food that remained here and lay down on the bed. With gloomy triumph, he summed up, with their joint efforts, humanity had failed natural selection. At least, within the city, there were no more people left. He was just an atavism, a kind of mammoth which was unlikely to exist for long, and he could not restore the human race alone, no matter how hard he wanted to. Now the city, and possibly the whole world, belonged to mutants. After that, he lived another 40 years. 40 years more than he had planned. There was laundry drying nearby, and he stopped to wash off the sticky blood and changed clothes, finding something more or less in size. After that, exhausted, he collapsed in a utility room with a generator that was emitting heat. Despite the universal fatigue, he could not fall asleep for a long time, and when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed all night that he was lying on the platform with corpses. When he woke up, he already knew what to do. Grabbing a canister of diesel fuel, he went to the surviving armory. Having collected everything he needed, he reached the station where he killed Prokofiev.
On the way, he thought about not closing the hermetic seal behind him, but then the thought arose that someone could have survived. However, this dilemma resolved itself. It was impossible to close the hermetic seal from the outside. Fyodor came to the surface and walked along the remembered street to look for the bunker where he was brought wounded after the battle where Siploy was killed. Having reasoned sensibly, he decided that he could not live in the metro. On the surface, it was a sunny, fine day. The trees, twisted by radiation, rustled with lush green leaves. White clouds crawled across the sky. Somewhere, mutants called to each other with inexplicable sounds. And nothing spoke of the tragedy that had unfolded underground. Only his soul was nasty. Having reached the shelter without incident, the first thing Fyodor did was fill up the generator. When he pressed the starter, it confidently puffed, and the darkness dissipated with light. Without much desire, Fyodor had a snack of the canned food that remained here and lay down on the bed. With gloomy triumph, he summed up, with their joint efforts, humanity had failed natural selection. At least within the city, there were no more people left. He was just an atavism, a kind of mammoth, which was unlikely to exist for long, and he could not restore the human race alone, no matter how hard he wanted to. Now the city, and possibly the whole world, belonged to mutants. After that, he lived another 40 years more than he had planned. Having reached the shelter without incident, the first thing Fyodor did was to fill up the generator. When he pressed the starter, it confidently puffed, and the darkness dissipated into light. Without much desire, Fyodor had a snack of the canned food that was left here and lay down on the bed. With gloomy triumph, he summed up, with their combined efforts, humanity had failed natural selection. At least within the city, there were no more people left. He was just an atavism, a kind of mammoth, which was unlikely to exist for long, and he could not restore the human race alone, no matter how hard he wanted to. Now the city, and possibly the whole world, belonged to mutants. After that, he lived another 40 years. 40 years more than he had planned. Having reached the shelter without incident, the first thing Fyodor did was to fill up the generator. When he pressed the starter, it confidently puffed and the darkness dissipated into light. Without much desire, Fyodor had a snack of the canned food that was left here and lay down on the bed. With gloomy triumph, he summed up, with their combined efforts, humanity had failed natural selection. At least within the city, there were no more people left. He was just an atavism,
a kind of mammoth, which was unlikely to exist for long. And he could not restore the human race alone, no matter how hard he wanted to.
Now the city, and possibly the whole world, belonged to mutants. After that, he lived another 40 years, 40 years more than he had planned. The first few days, Fyodor did not go to the surface, finishing the supplies he had grabbed from the metro and what was left in the bunker. The bitterness of loss had tormented him before, but the hurricane of recent events was whirling around him at such a speed that the former sentry had no time to think. Now, when he felt relatively safe, grief and despair were tearing his soul apart. For some reason, Fyodor thought that he had turned gray after what he had experienced. But when he found a dusty mirror in one of the rooms of the bunker, he was surprised to discover that his hair had remained the same dark color.
Day after day, Fyodor was haunted by a disgusting feeling that he was making a mistake. As if, while he was sitting here, there were survivors in the metro, and he needed to urgently return. In the future, he refuted this obsessive thought. But the trace in the form of unfounded anxiety during inaction sometimes visited him throughout his life. The first shock had not yet passed, as the supplies began to run out, and Fyodor realized that he would have to go to the surface. Then, he often thought about suicide. But remembering the episode with the safety catch, he no longer attempted it. Over time, he solved this problem by saying that he would live as long as he could, especially since without experience, sooner or later another trip to the city to search for food would definitely end in the death of the self-proclaimed stalker. Helpless anger at what had happened also played a role, and when, out of necessity, Fyodor climbed to the surface, he threw himself at any mutant who had the audacity to covet a lone stalker. Sometimes death passed very close. Once, it almost got him. Hearing the cry of a seagull, the man did not throw himself on the ground or hide in the holes of the entrances. Instead, Fyodor turned around, raised his machine gun, and finding a target, pulled the trigger. The bullets that dug into the seagull's body diminished its determination. But having accelerated, it did not have time to change its trajectory, and, by inertia, grabbed his beak or claws. Everything happened too quickly. By the hand. She dragged the stalker a couple of meters, but soon the chemical protection sleeve cracked and came off. Having slammed onto the asphalt, Fyodor jumped up abruptly. The crippled seagull was thrashing on the asphalt nearby, trying to get up, but the stalker pulled a pistol out of the holster and emptied half a clip, almost without aiming. The seagull on the ground was thrashing in agony, with a bullet in its head, and Fyodor picked up the dropped machine gun with his healthy hand and hobbled home, cradling his injured hand. When he came to the bunker, he was afraid that his hand was broken, because in this case he would not be able to get food and would be doomed to a slow and painful death from hunger. A week later, when he had almost finished off the entire supply of canned food remaining in the shelter, he was relieved to find that the swelling had gone down and he could move his hand almost without pain. From then on, he became more careful. Then, in the first days, his mind was seriously shaken. On the surface, he was tense and focused, but when he came home, his strength suddenly left him. He had difficulty taking off his chemical protection and crawled around the bunker. But both at home and on the surface, he constantly talked to himself. Perhaps he did it unconsciously, calming himself with the sound of his own voice. Then, in the first days, he first tried the meat of the shot mutants, which, according to the dosimeter, was clean from radiation. He consciously avoided the metro and tried to never go there, but still, the need forced him. At the dead metro stations, there were still fuel reserves of canned goods and dried mushrooms, and of course weapons. Fyodor joked to himself that he was a stalker in reverse. Stalkers of the past lived in the metro and stole swag from the city, while he, on the contrary, lived in the city and stole swag from the metro.
Just a week after the last war, as Fyodor called what happened to himself, without constant refueling, the generators died out and the stations plunged into darkness, which nobly hid the disgrace happening on the platforms. But life did not leave the metro. People left, and the stations and sections were inhabited by creatures that Fyodor, for some reason, feared more than any creatures they encountered on the surface. Maybe because he had never seen them. When Fyodor first returned to the metro for supplies, the stations were already plunged into darkness, and the corpses began to decompose. Fyodor prudently did not take off his chemical protection and gas mask, although it seemed to him that the stench penetrated through the filters, although he understood in his mind that this was impossible. He thanked fate at least for the fact that now it allowed him not to look at this.
However, he had to shine a light under his feet to step on fewer bodies, and the flashlight picked out scenes one more terrible than the other. In the very first days, the metro was inhabited by some kind of scavengers. When Fyodor first heard their barking cries and squeals in the darkness, he almost died of fear, and running up the escalator to the top, for a long time could not decide to go down into the metro. He tried shooting at the sound and shining a flashlight in all directions, but in his entire life he had never shot a single creature, and they skillfully dodged the flashlight beam. It seemed they were afraid of light. True, over the years they adapted to Fyodor's visits. Now every time he entered the wide-open hermetic seal, they met him with deathly silence. But when he walked along the platform, he still felt them nearby. Sharply moving the flashlight sometimes even snatched a shadow that managed to hide in the darkness before Fyodor had time to see it. And
they never attacked him, but he was afraid of them, to the point of trembling in his knees. Once he even suggested that they were the restless souls of the dead. In fact, Fyodor was a skeptic. But living alone in a dead city filled with monsters, you involuntarily become superstitious. Later, already safe, Fyodor joked to himself that if these scavengers knew that canned food could be eaten and bullets could be fired, they would decide that he was robbing them, close the doors, and not let the lone stalker into the metro. Once, Fyodor even had the crazy idea to start the generator at one of the stations and turn on the lights. But for some reason he never decided to do it. When he came home after a trip, every trip to the metro was a serious test for his nerves, so Fyodor preferred to look for useful things on the surface and hunt mutants, leaving canned food in reserve. He washed off the radioactive dust in the vestibule. He washed clothes and bed linen by hand in a basin. Dried bars of soap were quite often found in apartments. The electric stove, left over from the previous owners, served him faithfully for many years. Although his lifestyle had changed dramatically compared to life in the metro, he remained devoted to his love of reading. He dragged home all the clean and well-preserved books he could find, especially since this was the only entertainment other than wandering around the poisoned city with danger to life. One morning he was fired up with the idea of finding a working TV or computer, but no matter how many apartments he went around, the consumer society of his ancestors did not leave anything that would survive the end of the world. Except that once he found a seemingly working tape recorder, but to his disappointment he could not get it to work. When he plugged it into the socket, numbers and letters crawled across the dial. But after trying all the button combinations, it always showed only an inscription in an unfamiliar language that said, "No USB." What this meant, Fyodor did not understand. Often, in the evenings, when Fyodor became especially sad and lonely, he cherished the thought that somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, there were quite likely still living people. In fact, nothing held him back. He could, at any moment, pack his things, and, either on foot
or trying to find a working car in the garages, go in search of people. But each time he put off the decision for later. At night, he sometimes had dreams. Of course, many were incoherent and not memorable, but there were also those that made a strong impression. Some were good, in which he often saw friends whose faces he could no longer remember. Everyone was alive and happy, and there was no war. Fyodor did not like such dreams. They were just a sweet lie, with a bitter aftertaste. Because after waking up and realizing that it was just a dream, Fyodor could not get rid of the crushing feeling of melancholy for a long time. Yes, over the years he forgot the faces of his friends, but he still remembered the cheerful and confident voice of Horse. He never understood where this nickname came from. His friend's voice was never hoarse. But what can I say? It stuck. And Katya's sweet laughter, although he did not have time to spend much time with her. But he truly loved her. Sometimes he had nightmares. Such dreams were always abundantly covered in blood. He often saw the same dream. Fyodor runs through a dark tunnel with a machine gun in his hands. Explosions flashing in the darkness tear people apart. He runs so desperately, as if something could still be changed. On his way, he meets women, children, and men. And he shoots them, cuts them with a knife, strangles them. They do not want to die. Writhe in agony on the floor, clinging to his legs, and he beats them with the butt of his rifle. But they still do not die. On such nights he woke up in a cold sweat, breathing heavily. Usually he couldn't fall asleep any longer and turned on all the lights, poured boiling water. Sometimes he found still usable boxes of tea in the store warehouses, but this happened so rarely that you can count them on your fingers. And so instead of tea, he drank hot water and started reading a book to distract himself from heavy thoughts, although it rarely helped. Unlike good dreams, these were more like the truth. He simply hated such dreams. But most often he had another dream. He couldn't call it good or bad. He dreamed that he was just walking around the city on the surface, and all the time, counting something. When he woke up, he couldn't remember what he was looking for. Once he had a nightmare that impressed him very much. Fyodor entered the station. As far as he could tell, it was his native station. It was in semi-darkness, and only the emergency lights gave a dim light. In the darkness, he saw many people on the platform. It was a real massacre. The men and women were hitting each other with their hands, biting each other with their teeth, beating each other with pieces of rebar. Fyodor screamed in horror at them to stop, slipping on the blood-stained tiles. He tried to pull them away from each other, but they broke free, pushed him away, and continued their terrible occupation. When his eyes got used to the semi-darkness, he recoiled in horror, realizing that these were not people at all, or rather, not quite people. They had completely human bodies, but instead of faces, they had animal muzzles. There were animals that he had seen in a children's encyclopedia, and mutants that he had met on the surface. And like animals, they bit each other's throats, tore each other apart, and only the eyes filled with anger in their blood-stained muzzles were human. But what struck him even more was his own reflection in their eyes. If they were monsters, then Fyodor himself was simply the king of monsters. His hideous appearance was woven from dark green rubber. Instead of a mouth, filter bubbles stuck out in different directions. And instead of eyes, there was glass behind which darkness swirled. This darkness was so primordial and impenetrable that he involuntarily stared, and it swallowed everything around him. He lay in the darkness for a long time, not realizing that he had already woken up. And then, cursing, he felt for a flashlight in the darkness and, walking along the corridor, turned on the generator that had somehow stalled. Fyodor remembered the dream in the smallest detail and thought for a long time what it meant. As a result, After this dream, he decided that he would not go looking for people outside the city. People cannot change their nature, and even if he finds a peaceful community, sooner or later, something similar will happen, and his already mutilated soul may not withstand it a second time. Another time, he had a very insidious dream. Fyodor couldn't call it good or bad. It was rather sad. He dreamed that in the blue light of the evening twilight, he was going down the escalator in the metro, but for some reason not feeling any fear. And there, in the darkness of the station, right in the middle of the platform, a guiding star was shining from a small fire. When he woke up, he was determined that this dream was prophetic, and subsequently, despite the fear, he walked around almost all the metro stations. He spent several days and a lot of nerves on this, but at no station did he see any light or traces of a fire. Only white bones covered the floor, and the scavengers, frightened by the light, disapprovingly barked. He did not visit his native station. He hesitated for a long time, afraid that the sight of the destroyed house in which he once grew up would not leave a new scar on his soul. But that time he finally decided. With surprise and annoyance, he discovered that, apparently, the vaults of the station had collapsed under the action of powerful explosions. Both tunnels rested on a rubble, and on the surface in the place under which the station was located, an entire block had sunk, turning into a pile of concrete. From then on, he was finally convinced that there were no people left in the city, although he still could not believe that he was the only one who was lucky enough to survive the massacre, and absolutely by accident. After all, there were most likely stalkers who were on the surface during the last battle. But, Fyodor immediately answered himself, most likely stalkers were also involved in the battles. However, one day an unusual event happened. He was sitting in an apartment on the second floor and was waiting for a crowd of wild boars to appear on the street. In the spring, they had a seasonal migration, and he hoped to shoot one or two when they passed through the city. The street in front of the entrance to his shelter was as if in the palm of his hand, and he simply fell into a stupor when several people dressed in chemical protection with machine guns in their hands came out of the alley. The first thing he wanted to do was run out of the shelter and rush to meet them. But suppressing this desire, he continued to watch. People stood right next to the entrance to his shelter. Some looked around and others stared straight at the door, holding machine guns cocked in their hands, and waited. Fyodor's heart ached. He vividly remembered the war, remembered the interrogation before it all ended, remembered the dream where people bared their true faces to him. Man is a dangerous beast, and I have a short conversation with dangerous beasts on my territory, Fyodor whispered, and calmly killed them all. Despite their menacing appearance, they still did not understand where they were being shot at. Then, not knowing what to think, he went down, went outside, and, approaching the entrance to the shelter, discovered the absence of corpses. In addition, there were no traces of people at all, no traces of blood on the asphalt, no boot prints where they had walked, and only the potholes from Fyodor's bullets on the asphalt reminded him of what had happened. Then, he felt very uneasy and, giving up hunting, went home, after which he did not go outside for several days. That incident made him seriously doubt his mental health, but over time he calmed down and decided that he could not do anything about it anyway. Over the years, he learned the habits of all, or at least most, of the mutants that roamed the city. He knew how to avoid encounters with some, and how best to win a fight with others. And of course, sometimes animals from other parts of the city, or even those who came there from outside, wandered into his domain. Sometimes when he encountered something particularly creepy, he did not know what to do. For example, once a swarm of huge insects, similar to locusts, flew over the city. Then Fyodor hid in the bunker in the hope that they would simply fly past. Fortunately, this is what happened. And another time, while wandering through the courtyards, the stalker saw a huge spider, the size of 2 adult people, hanging on a thick web stretched between 2 houses. And these were courtyards close to his shelter, and Fyodor remembered that there was definitely nothing like that here. Having followed it, he found something like a nest of cocaine in the apartment of the neighboring house, and without sparing a canister of fuel, he burned everything there. He did not know how to kill the spider itself, and simply avoided that courtyard, occasionally making sure that the spider was sitting there. This continued until Fyodor was surprised to find that its paw had been torn off. Then he realized that the spider had been dead for a long time, and in fact, only the chitinous shell, eaten away from the inside, remained.
The mutants, in turn, also adapted to Fyodor, and the weaker ones began to avoid a small area near the entrance to his shelter. And he sent away the stupid or strong ones with bullets. Of course, there were situations when he had to flee. Fyodor was afraid of the first winter, believing that it would be more difficult to find food, which was partly true, because some mutants apparently hibernated. And the streets covered in snow slowed down movement, although Fyodor quickly found a plus. By the tracks, he could determine who had been here and where they had gone. Every winter, his cherished dream was to stumble upon human tracks, and Fyodor even found them, with bated breath, several times, but then quickly realized that they were his own. In the late spring and summer, the weather was wonderful, and Fyodor wished he could take off his gas mask and let the fresh wind blow on his face. But one day he found a pair of respirators at a factory. And now, on warm, dry days, he wore a respirator instead of a gas mask, although in wet and cold weather he still preferred the waterproof rubber of the gas mask. One summer, when Fyodor was celebrating the 10th anniversary of his departure from the metro, he noticed that he was being followed. A large black dog was watching him from a respectful distance. Fyodor had encountered mutant stray dogs before and knew that the pack was somewhere nearby. In general, they rarely poked their noses into his domain, preferring to avoid a dangerous enemy. But in other parts of the city, there were a great many of them, and sometimes clashes did occur. He dropped to one knee and aimed his machine gun at her, but then stopped himself. If he shot, the whole pack would come running. Or even mutants more terrible than dogs. Without letting go of the machine gun and looking around, Fyodor returned to the shelter and took up a position in the apartment on the 2nd floor. The dog did not show up for 20 minutes, and Fyodor went on. He had already forgotten about that incident, and the next day he was surprised to find the same dog. It seemed that now she came closer. Having followed her, he realized that there was no pack nearby and stopped paying attention to her. But that dog turned out to be very annoying, as if she had nothing better to do than watch Fyodor. It reached the point of absurdity. She followed him at a distance of 50 meters, as if that was how it should be, sometimes lagging behind but always returning. When Fyodor stopped, she also stopped. In the way she looked at him, Fyodor thought it was mockery. Suddenly, Fyodor realized that he had gotten used to her. When he left the shelter, in addition to the standard inspection of the area for an ambush, he immediately thought about where that dog was sitting. Having thought about it, he took a step towards her. The dog, frightened by such a turn of events, ran away, restoring the distance but did not leave. Fyodor was just returning from hunting, and in his bag there were pieces of meat cut from a shot mutant. After thinking, he put one of the pieces on the asphalt and walked a couple of meters away. The dog carefully approached, sniffed the treat, looked at Fyodor. In her gaze was either gratitude or bewilderment. Of course you can't feed the mutants. They won't leave then, thought Fyodor. But there was no one to blame him. Since then, she always met him at the exit from the shelter, happily wagging her tail, and was just as happy when he returned home, often leaving her something tasty.
He even thought that since this happened, he could build her a kennel. But the problem was solved by itself. One day when Fyodor returned and went down to the shelter, the dog followed him. He critically examined her. At first glance, no mutations were noticeable. And only after looking closely did he notice a couple of bald spots on her fur and an abnormal number of toes on her paws. Having moved the dosimeter nearby, he made sure that she was not radiating X-rays and sighed, let her into the shelter. Since then, they began to live together. Looking at the dog closer, he learned that it was a female. The fur, as he had observed before, was completely black, and the eyes were bright golden. Fyodor quickly became attached to her. At first, during the hunt, he was afraid that something would happen to her. But his fears were in vain. She did not rush at enemies that were too tough for her, and moreover, somehow, she understood and did not run out under the bullets when Fyodor shot. It was more difficult to teach her to wash when they returned from the surface. The stream of water from the shower terrified her, but over time she got used to it and stoically endured such procedures. They ate the same food if we are talking about the meat of mutants obtained during the hunt. Life became more fun. Fyodor no longer felt completely lonely. But the dog could not completely replace human communication. For example, she could not understand his words, and he was burdened that he could not share his grief and joys with anyone. When he tried to speak, she tilted her head to the side and listened attentively, trying hard to understand. But judging by the constant expression of a fanged smile on her face, he understood that the meaning of the words remained inaccessible to her. Once, having found a pile of empty, well-preserved school notebooks in one of the endless apartments, Fyodor began to keep a diary. There he described the events that particularly impressed him in a confused and subjective way. Once a thunderstorm raged on the surface. It did not stop for several days, and Fyodor sat in the shelter without leaving. Usually cheerful, the dog slept most of the time. And then Fyodor decided to write down in one of the clean notebooks the entire history of the city, after the apocalypse and before the last war. He did not know why he should do this, but a desperate desire to share with someone did not give him peace. Life became more or less measured. The dog was very useful on the hunt. With some kind of instinct, she understood when something bad was happening nearby and began to whine. In such cases, Fyodor immediately went to another place. When she sensed mutants, she began to sniff the ground with concentration, finding tracks, and thus the hunt became many times easier. At first, Fyodor could not recognize these signals, but when he learned, encounters with especially dangerous monsters were reduced to a minimum. Still, sometimes Fyodor had to go down to the subway again. The dog did not show any signs of reluctance to go there, but Fyodor always left her outside. For some reason, it seemed to him that it was better for a living soul not to appear in that kingdom of death. To his collection of recurring nightmares was added a dream in which Prokofiev shoots trying to kill his dog, and Fyodor, mad with anger, having no weapon, bites his neck with his teeth, tasting blood. At night, of course, this dream scared him just like any other nightmare, and Fyodor walked around the shelter until he found the dog and made sure that everything was okay with it. During the day, this dream amused him. This man took everything I had from me and did not even notice, and now, while I live, his rotting remains are eaten by rats, Fyodor commented. Thus they lived for 30 long years. But Fyodor always left her outside. For some reason it seemed to him that it was better for a living soul not to appear in that kingdom of death. To his collection of recurring nightmares was added a dream where Prokofiev shoots, trying to kill his dog, and Fyodor, mad with anger, having no weapon, bites into his neck with his teeth, feeling the taste of blood. At night, of course, this dream scared him just like any other nightmare, and Fyodor walked around the shelter until he found the dog and made sure that everything was okay with it. During the day, this dream amused him. This man took everything I had from me and didn't even notice. And now, while I'm alive, his rotting remains are being eaten by rats, Fyodor commented. Thus they lived for 30 long years. But Fyodor always left her outside. For some reason it seemed to him that it was better for a living soul not to appear in that kingdom of death. To his collection of recurring nightmares was added a dream where Prokofiev shoots trying to kill his dog, and Fyodor, mad with anger, having no weapon, bites into his neck with his teeth, feeling the taste of blood. At night, of course, this dream scared him just like any other nightmare. And Fyodor walked around the shelter until he found the dog and made sure that everything was okay with it. During the day, this dream amused him. This man took everything I had from me and didn't even notice. And now, while I'm alive, his rotting remains are being eaten by rats, Fyodor commented. Thus they lived for 30 long years. Fyodor didn't know exactly how many years had passed since the last war had destroyed humanity. He had long since lost count. But he knew that many, many years had passed. He was already old and he could feel it. His once dark hair had turned completely gray. His face was furrowed with deep wrinkles.
For many years he had shaved out of habit, but now he had stopped doing so, and a gray beard adorned his face. Having lived in a post-apocalyptic city, in every sense, for most of his life, he had watched how quickly it was evolving. Many of the surviving houses were braided with bindweed. Others had collapsed under the pressure of time. Where the asphalt had once been covered in cracks and moss had grown here and there, lush bushes now stood out. Mutants also changed over time. Entire species appeared and disappeared. Others changed. For example, seagulls, which had previously ruled the sky, had lost all their feathers over time. At first, seeing the bald specimens, Fyodor thought that they were sick. But over the years there were fewer and fewer feathers on them. And now the once white seagulls were gray creatures with leathery wings and rare purple-green feathers. The beak was also overgrown with gray skin. Now they looked more like pterodactyls from the ever-memorable children's encyclopedia. Although it would probably be more correct to call it regression. They became less graceful in flight, and the flapping of their wings could now be heard from afar. No, of course they still remained very dangerous. Although, in comparison with those seagulls fighters with which Fyodor fought in his youth, they cannot be compared. Although Fyodor himself looked bad compared to what he used to be. And what can I say? He was an old man. In his youth, he dragged from the subway, as it seemed to him, everything that was possible and had not visited there for 10 or 15 years. The metro had also changed, turning into a complex ecosystem, for which Fyodor was an alien, and broke the darkness with his flashlight, under the cover of which the life of the underground inhabitants took place. Often in the evenings, stroking the head of his faithful dog with whom he lived half his life, Fyodor thought about what could have been if he had acted differently in his life. Even in the first years, he thought about what he could have done to prevent the war. Of course, in the end, he always came to the conclusion that nothing. However, this did not stop him from imagining what his life would have been like if none of this had happened. Although he had a hard time imagining it, the thought of what would have happened if he had left the city and gone in search of people found a greater response in his heart. What unthinkable path would have awaited him beyond the horizon? Perhaps, Fyodor summed up, I will never know the answer.
With each passing year, old age made itself felt more and more. Old wounds ached, walking long distances became unbearably difficult, and Fyodor, having exchanged his machine gun for a rifle, obtained food in another way.
Having arranged a couple of apartments with windows facing different sides of the street, Fyodor simply took up a position and waited for some unlucky mutant to appear in the firing zone. His dog had fallen ill at some unspecified point. No, she hadn't caught an infection or anything like that. It was just that, once fast and restless, she spent more time lying on her favorite pile of clothes in the corner of the room. When they came to the surface, she wandered around the shelter without much enthusiasm, after which they went into the apartment. While Fyodor was aiming for prey, the dog lay down in the corner of the room and waited. The only thing she did was, if uninvited guests appeared in the entrance, she jumped up, letting Fyodor know that they had problems. With the onset of old age, Fyodor began to feel like easy prey.
Despite the fact that all these decades, from hundreds of fights, he always, and even without serious injuries, emerged victorious. Now he felt that he was no longer the same as before. His old joints ached and he could not move quickly. His finger on the trigger trembled, and his vision had noticeably worsened. The latter greatly upset Fyodor. He picked up glasses that had been preserved in some store. But over time his vision still began to get worse. Therefore, when he came to the surface, he understood that if some mutant came within throwing distance, he would hardly be able to oppose it now. Fyodor began to come to the surface less often, and the dog's behavior made him nervous. She slept a lot, almost never played, and only when he approached her, she, as before, began to wag her tail, smiling like a dog. Golden eyes, as if glowing with a warm light, remained just as young. Once, entering his room, he saw a common picture. The dog, cutely sprawled on a pile of rags, was sleeping. Fyodor looked at her until he realized with horror that her chest was not rising from breathing. Sitting on his knees, he put his hand to see if the heart was beating. The awakened dog looked at him in bewilderment, after which she licked his hand. His heart was relieved, but he was still scared more than once when she slept like that. But one day, what was bound to happen sooner or later did happen. Entering the room, returning from the kitchen, Fyodor saw that the dog was lying in her favorite place. Without worrying, he went up to stroke her, and then he felt that she was not breathing. Still not believing what had happened, he put his ear to her chest. His heart was not beating. Fyodor sat down heavily next to her and dragged her heavy body onto his lap. Her face looked as if she was simply sleeping. He sat for a very long time, stroking the dog's hard fur, feeling how the warmth of life slowly left her body. For the first time in many years, tears streamed down his wrinkled face. He did not know what to do next. The very thought of carrying her to the surface and leaving her there alone terrified him. With his mind, he understood that she was already dead, but his soul simply could not accept it. He thought dazedly about how he would have to live alone again, just like in those difficult first years. He couldn't imagine it. Then he got very sick. He didn't have a temperature or blood pressure. He just felt very bad. He stopped coming to the surface altogether. Unlimited consumption of canned food from the emergency reserve. Moreover, he almost never got out of bed. In the last days, his mind had completely abandoned him. He lay in bed all the time, almost did not understand where he was. He saw his friends, whose voices had long since died down. But in spite of everything, they walked around the bunker, talked to each other, and laughed loudly. Sometimes they came into the room and encouraged him. "It's nothing.
Just lie around for a week and you'll be running again. You're so strong, you'll live to be 100. Fyodor believed their words and hoped that he would soon be able to get up. He couldn't wait to tell his friends everything that had accumulated over the years. He was glad that everything ended so well, and how could he even think that he was left alone? The dog was also alive. She often ran into his room and buried her cold, wet nose in Fyodor's hand. When he looked at her, she began to wag her tail and smile, with her tongue hanging out, wanting him to get up and play with her. When Fyodor's heart finally stopped, he was still in the arms of delirium, having died happy. Dust settled on his extinguished wide-open eyes, and days and nights alternated on the surface.
The shelter in which he lived most of his life became his refuge after death. In the darkness of his personal tomb, which the bunker had turned into, like an ancient pharaoh, he was buried with his treasures. Anyone who dared to disturb the peace of the tomb could find canisters of diesel fuel, the remains of canned food, zinc boxes with cartridges. Fyodor had not shot even half of what he brought from the metro in 40 years. But the most important treasure was the manuscript, which concealed a story on its yellowed pages. Soaked in pain and injustice, the story of the life of one man, and at the same time, of all mankind. Petrozavodsk, 2022.